So, good evening, Democrats and friendly unaffiliateds and other members of the opposition. I'm Vicki Shea. I'm the chair of the club, and we're in the Farrington Gathering Place, which is the Homeowners Association building here, and we're also on Zoom. So we have people listening from home, and we will be recording this, and we'll post the link on our website sometime next week. So we're coming at you from all directions. 4 quick reminders, please turn off your cell phones. And please don't throw out the beverage cups. They're hard plastic, and we wash them in the dishwasher in between meetings so that we're doing our little part of not throwing more plastic away. So you can just bring them back over there. To ask a question when we get to that part, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. We have 2 helpful volunteers who will bring the microphone to you, and we really need people to speak into the microphone and not think that your voice is loud enough for everybody's ears. Plus, the people on Zoom need you to speak into the microphone so they can hear. And the Zoom people can type questions into the chat box and they'll be read out for them. And finally, you don't need to put up the chairs at the end, which people very eagerly and helpfully do, but we have somebody who comes and puts them all away. So you're welcome to just walk away from them. Okay, so the speaker this evening is Bill Horner, who was the editor and publisher of the Chatham News and Record back when it was good, from 2018 to 2023. And he was at the Sanford Herald for 3 decades before that. And as you know, he's going to speak about journalism's role in today's pick your own truth world. And I took some time to think about that title. We do pick our own truth. Psychologically, that's true because we each see the world and see each other through our own eyes. And I can't see what you see no matter what. But can we pick our own truth about the price of eggs and the price of gas? Can we have different opinions about the effectiveness of ivermectin in treating COVID? Can we choose to believe that Trump was or was not convicted of 34 felonies? If facts are true, how do we encounter those facts? What is journalism's role in pointing toward external truths and facts? Let's hear from Bill Horner.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here and so thankful for the invitation. I want to thank Mary for asking me here and Chris for your help too. Before I get started, I want to introduce a couple of folks. First of all, Dr. Chip Pate and Rose Pate, friends of mine. They live here in Pittsburgh. Chip and I don't talk a lot, but we text a lot. We're constantly sharing stories that we see that kind of infuriate us or make us excited. Back and forth, but I invited them here. Thanks for coming. And then Melanie Seal, some of you may know Melanie. Melanie is the former executive editor of the News Observer in Raleigh. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner and a member of the North Carolina Journalism Hall of Fame. Melanie should be the one speaking tonight, and I invited her here to kind of help me with the Q&A. Melanie is so much more astute than I am about these issues. And so I'm going to have her come up. I have been trying to get her. I've been talking to her for years about writing a book, and I'm going to share some of her work during the presentation. But Melanie's was a big supporter of us at the News and Record and has been a great friend. So thank you for being here. Okay. So talking about free press in a democracy, we're at a point right now where I'm going to tell you, I've got so much to cover, and there's a lot of things that I'm not going to have a chance to cover tonight, but I hope that I'm going to leave you with some things to think about. We are living in some really, really strange times, some really bizarre times. We talk about the fire hose, about flooding the zone, and we're in a situation now where it's hard to really believe what's real. So I'm going to start off with a few reminders, a few things to kind of jog your memory and make you think about what's real or what's not. Things have really changed. The country's changing. The way that enforcement is being done is changing. We're having to find new names for things, new ways to describe things. all around. We're seeing things in our country that we never thought we would see before, and cruelties that we cannot imagine. We're being told that the country's falling apart and there's only one person who can fix it. We're seeing some real incongruencies in the way politicking is done, the way the country is being run. We're seeing cruelty that we could not imagine. We're seeing a government that was developed and created and structured to protect us, now doing the exact opposite. We're seeing elections threatened. This has been an ongoing issue that I know you've paid attention to, but the threat is very, very real. It's not just imaginary now, as Chip and I were talking about before. This stuff is really happening now. We're seeing things change in DC in ways that we couldn't imagine. We're seeing the White House, which has talked about fake news for so long, actually doing fake news, actually creating fake images and putting out his news and reality. We're seeing media bias being turned inside out. We're seeing this, which is as an old newspaper guy and being familiar with the Stars and Stripes is disheartening. We're getting lectures about faith and theology. At the center of everything seems to be one man who seems to be intent on enriching himself and his family, seems to be intent on establishing a kingdom. And here's the problem. The problem is that it's working for about 25 to 30% of the people in the United States. The president is a savior to them, someone who is the only person who can take a country that's burning and falling apart and disintegrating and making it right. That's the belief that some of you folks have. We're going to talk a little bit about why that happened. There's supposed to be... Well, I have a video that did not show up somehow. Here it comes. Okay, this is the video is not showing. My apologies. The video is that the Trump AI generated video where he's in the Trump jet dumping mud on the protesters on No King's Day. You've all seen that. That was going to be a nice little kicker to that little display of headlines and editorial cartoons. So we're at a point right now where it's disheartening and sobering, especially for me as a journalist. This is an old New Yorker cartoon, for probably 20 years old, that I cut out. And the reason I cut it out, first of all, is because sometimes the news can be distressing and depressing. But I cut it out years ago because what is so interesting to me about this cartoon is you've got the husband on the left reading the print copy of the paper and his wife on the right reading on her tablet or her iPad or something. You know, he's drinking some kind of bourbon and she's drinking wine. And that's kind of, even though it's 20 years old, it's still really apropos today. So if you feel like this is all about Trump, I'm going to talk a fair bit about Donald Trump tonight, but the reality is that what's happening in Trump 2.0 combined with what's taking place in newsrooms around the country, we're at a point where we really need to be paying close attention to what's happening, particularly where the free press, the First Amendment is involved. So it's not just weird anymore, it's a very, very dangerous place, and I'm going to talk about that. So I'm going to cover, well, let me tell you about this first. The core issue, the thing that you should really be concerned about, and the thing that as I've followed the industry, I was sharing with Mary that I collect for 30 years now. I've collected articles and stories about the news industry. And we're at a unique point right now because we're at a time where there's never been more access to news and information than there is right now digitally. Everywhere you turn, there's lots of access. Unfortunately, not a lot of it's good. But we're in a reality crisis. So we're in a situation where we don't really know, where so many people are so confused about what reality is. And that's the core of the message tonight. And I think that this cartoon sums it up. This is a Boston Globe editorial cartoon that came out fairly early in the Iranian war. But I think it really illustrates the frustration that a lot of us have about running into what is truth and reality and the reaction of the administration. So what I'm going to talk tonight, I'm going to talk in three different areas. I'm going to go very, very quickly. I'm actually going to provide a copy of the slides for you, along with a list of articles and books and so forth. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So if I happen to gloss over something, you'll have a chance to spend time with it if you want to. But I'm going to talk first about the changing news ecosystem, the newspaper industry, the news industry, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about newspapers since that's my background. It's changing so rapidly. It's been changing and evolving for 200 years, but the change that's happening right now is really stark. I'm going to talk about some societal changes and the fact that that's resulted in what I'm calling a dumbed down electorate, and people who are not following the news are following the wrong type of news. And so when they go to the polls, if they go to the polls, they're making decisions based on things that aren't factual. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when you have an authoritarian regime, an authoritarian administration, and particularly what that means for the press. So you can imagine, you can probably guess where I'm going to end up. We're going to talk about the First Amendment. We're going to talk about the free press and how important they are, particularly thinking about the role that they've played in the formation and the foundation, the success of the United States as a nation. So starting off here with the changing news ecosystem, this is a quote from Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the primary writers of the Declaration of Independence, our third president. Every journalist at some point or another in either their training or their career comes across this quote. It's a very famous quote amongst journalists where Jefferson says if he had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, he would choose newspapers without a government. The Supreme Court has reinforced this. This is a quote from Hugo Black. He was a justice for many, many years. And I've highlighted the fact that the government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censor the government. That's part of the enshrined in our Constitution, that the press has the ability to do that. Now, leaders all over the world recognize that. They recognize the power of the press. Here's a quote from Viktor Orban, the outgoing Hungary prime minister, talking about the power of the press. But the press is not always popular. This is a Far Side cartoon, again, probably 20-some years old. I used to have this framed in my office when I was publisher of the Sanford Herald, because it really illustrates so much the fickleness of readers of the press and kind of the power of the press. If you can't read that, the caption says, "Hot off the press, the very first edition of the Desert Island Times caused the newspaper to quickly fold." And the headline in the paper is, "Ned is a whiner." So the press, it can be a very unpopular place to be, being in the press. I think about during our time at the Chatham News and Record, there's rarely been a journalist who hasn't been accused of being biased or being fake news. Back in my days at the Sanford Herald, we were preparing to do a series of stories on our municipal golf course, talking about the head pro of the golf course who actually got all the revenue from the concessions and from the pro shop. And the day that the story appeared, I woke up with roofing nails in my driveway, went to work and had 3 flat tires on the way to work. My wife, Leanne, who was here, had flat tires. The policeman who came to the house ran over roofing nails and had flat tires. Sometimes the press can be very unpopular, even among Democrats. So the Chatham News and Record, when we broke the story about the cyber breach in the county, in the Chatham County government, we actually had a Democratic county commissioner try to get his fellow commissioners to agree to boycott the paper. So the county was doing legal advertising with the News and Record. And part of that is the tax liens, the tax listings every year that were thousands of dollars of revenue for us. It's a state mandated legislative act that the counties had to do, and he wanted to undo that just because he was so mad at us. So The press can be unpopular. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, the same guy who said he preferred newspapers without a country, said this about a year later in a letter talking about newspapers. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. So sometimes people who can cheer the press, sometimes they cannot cheer as well. But what we have with us is the First Amendment. The First Amendment is enshrined in our creation as a nation. Basically says that the Congress can't create any laws that would take away rights from the press. Now, I don't know what sparked the comment that Jefferson had when he was down on newspapers, but thinking about the First Amendment, it would be really wonderful if everybody could agree on two things. Number one is that journalism is not the enemy of the people. It's the mechanism by which the people know what their government is doing. And number two, not everything you dislike is false, and not everything that you like in journalism is true. If we could all agree on those things, I think that there would be a lot more cooperation, collaboration. I think our country would head in a different direction. Unfortunately, that's not where we are. A few months ago, there was a movement among journalists to change their profile pictures on whatever social media platform you were on to the First Amendment, and I did that. It was amazing to me the people who, and I did it with no comment, but people who attacked the fact that I changed my profile picture to the First Amendment. Interesting. So. The First Amendment also includes the right to free speech, as we know, and unfortunately where we're headed in these days right now, and I know you've all seen this, is my speech is okay. If your speech is okay too, if you agree with me. If you don't agree with me, your speech is not okay. So to talk a little bit just briefly about the newspaper industry, several years ago, I was in this very room doing a presentation to a group about the 4 disruptors of the newspaper industry. It's a long presentation. I've got it boiled down into one slide right now. So what's happened in the newspaper industry, which is, I talk about this to illustrate the fact that the monetizing the news business is very, very difficult these days. There was the collapse of the advertising business model that made newspapers work. That collapse of the business model created disruptions and revenue shrank. Because of that, the size of newsrooms had to shrink, market penetration dropped, along with trust and relevance. And then we got to a situation with digital technology, with the internet, where the tech giants really kind of seize control and have more of the messaging. So that's been part of the disruption in that part of the industry. Another thing that's changed is the fact that with social media, with the internet, and with digital technology, attention's been pulled away from news, particularly from print journalism. This is a chart that shows how time spent with media has changed over the years. This particular chart says that the average person spends 16 minutes looking at print media. There's another study that I came across that said the average person in the United States spends 4 minutes a day consuming news. So that's changed too. The good news is that good journalism is really still happening. There's more of it in digital, less of it in print. There's a lot more nonprofit journalism that's really succeeding and doing well and doing good work. And there are a lot of smaller operations, 1, 2, and 3 people operations, even here in North Carolina, that are serving the communities really, really well. And it's really not complicated. Strong journalism is very, very simple. Find the truth, report it, provide context, be the eyes and the ears, reflect your community, and explain, advocate, and challenge. It's not really difficult to make that happen. But there are some really troubling trends happening because of the growth of digital and the growth of that part of the news. Back in the old days, when Melanie and I were younger in our career, we had a press in our building. And the barrier to entry for a newspaper was high because you had to spend $1 million to have a press. Now everybody has a press. If you've got a phone, if you've got a Facebook account or an Instagram account or a blog, you've got your own press. And some of those trends that are troubling is for thinking about consumers and how people take in news. It's more about entertainment rather than information. Anger and fear is driving a lot of what people like to post. Trends are amplified, not what matters. And I understand that. When I was at the News and Record, we did a long series of stories on property revaluation in Chatham County. They just got no traction, and it's not sexy, but it was really important work for people who were seeing their property values go up and then their property taxes as well. There are a lot of pundits today. That's the self-absorption of social media. There's a lot more pundits than reporters. Less concerns about quality, and there's a lot of people are setting up what they post to be a you versus me situation. The most troubling trend, though, is this: we've moved from being able to at least agree on what the facts are and being able to debate about policy to not even being able to agree about what reality is itself. And among our audiences, what we're seeing is a lot of growing media illiteracy. Now, back in my earlier newspaper days, we used to talk a lot about media literacy and talk a lot about what we as newspapers needed to do to be able to talk to people about how to use our product. We did a lot of talking, we didn't do a whole lot about it. And now we're kind of paying the price. When I was in college, I subscribed to 7 different newspapers. And the last time I spoke to a journalism class at UNC, nobody subscribed to a print newspaper. They subscribed online, but most of them would only read 1 or 2 news sources. There's also the danger of the broad brush of talking about the media, everybody who's in the news organization realm being a part of the media, when there's lots of differences. Some folks have standards, some don't. I wish I had more time to talk about that. There's also the growth of misinformation and disinformation and so forth. Cocooning, which means only listening to or reading news organizations that line up with your ideology. So those are some of the trends. Some considerations. I'm going to run through these really quickly, but there's some things to think about that will help you kind of understand the next 2 sections. Processing the news is hard work. If you follow the news, if you subscribe to 2 or 3 or 4 publications, if you're like me and you subscribe to 50 or 60 newsletters, it's very hard work to process all that information. And for a lot of people, news fatigue is something that creeps in. It's too much work to follow that, so it's much easier for me to just rely on one source, whether it's CNN or Fox News or whatever, just to simplify things where you're not going to get the full scope of information. And then the rage economy that's driving so much of the news. A couple of things here. A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, I'm going to talk about him, and I'm going to share a couple of articles that he's written with you and quote him some. But I think this is important. A free and trusted press is in the unique position to foster a mutual understanding that allows a diverse, divided nation to come together with a common purpose. And that's true. But as news organizations have been asking people in power tough questions to hold them to account, there's been a lot of pushback. So while 70% of the country, or 50%, I don't know what the number is, while a good percentage of the country wants news, local news organizations, national news organizations to succeed, there's 30% of the country that is cheering on the failure and the disintegration of the news ecosystem. Something else from A.G. Sulzberger, and this is interesting: large companies, nonprofits, and foundations are fearing retaliation for supporting news organizations. And this is a very real threat, because news is expensive to reporters, editors. Producing news is very labor intensive. It costs a lot of money to do that. And when you don't have the support from advertisers, then you have to rely on reader support. And the expectation among most readers is, I want it free. David Brooks, former New York Times columnist who now writes for Atlantic Magazine, has written very astutely about this. Interesting what he says here, and again, the article from which I drew this from, you're going to get a copy of it. There's no shared moral order. One of the biggest problems in living in a society with no shared moral order is that we have no way to settle arguments. No way to settle arguments because we can't agree on what the truth is. A few more things about where this has taken us. A free press depends on belief in the legitimacy of the First Amendment and the right of news organizations to ask tough questions. If that erodes, the First Amendment may still be here, but its function is going to weaken. interesting in reading, and I'm going to provide you in the email that you're going to get that has all these links. There's a story that talks about the fact that the number of countries who have a good record of protecting press freedoms has dropped by half. The number of countries that have fake news laws now has grown by sevenfold in the last few years. And that is countries around the world can prosecute you if you're a reporter if they claim that what you report is fake news, even though it may not be. We know about woke, natural human empathy, the way that we would define it. It's been transmogrified into the pejorative woke. So America is no longer the land of the free, but rather the home of the intolerant, bigoted, and totally self-interested. And I know you're following the stories about CNN, and I wish I had time to devote time to all the media organizations that the Trump and Trump cronies and Trump supporters are looking at buying. But this is from Jim Acosta, who's a former CNN anchor, and he talks about state-dominated, state-controlled media owned by oligarchs in service to Trump, all in the name of special treatment. Those comments were made in an address that he gave on C-SPAN to a group of journalists, and I'm actually going to provide you a link to that so you can watch it. It's pretty interesting watching. Now, good journalism we know works. It's unbiased. It's based on discipline. It's verification based. Evidence matters. Good journalism is sourced, and accountability matters. And being wrong as a journalist is just unacceptable. And we've all been wrong. We all make mistakes. The thing that we do that's different, particularly less in the newspaper business, is we have a place. If the story has a mistake or there's a factual error on the front page, and in the next edition, the correction is going to be on the front page. We're accountable for our work. So moving into part two and talking about society, tribalism, division, and so forth. You know this, you've seen this happen around you. We used to be people who could disagree agreeably. We could be friends with people that we had different beliefs from. But now, this is where we are. This is actually from David French. David French is a New York Times columnist that I really like, and he talks in a podcast about the fact that disagreement equals degeneracy. So for a lot of people in the Republican Party, if you disagree with them, you're degenerate. But if you're nice about it, you're demonic. And that's just a really, really sad place for us to be in our country. We're seeing things like this. So there is a group of people in Sanford, where I live, that have a Facebook page called Truth Seekers of North Carolina. And we all remember the Trump's Truth Social post about Robert Mueller. So this guy, Steve Gunner in Sanford, posted this, claiming that the post that the newspapers and all the news organizations were writing about was fake, and that the real post was what he put below. When he posted this on the Truth Social page, it was really interesting to watch the comments, and people go, you know, you're wrong. And they had links to stories, and he would immediately go into attack mode and calling them all sorts of different names. This is very, very common these days, as you've probably seen. So we're the only democracy where we hate the other party more than we like our own party. And we're the only country in advanced democracy where we see so many of our fellow citizens as bad people. This is where we've gone in society. New norms, name calling, hatred, polarization, news fatigue. We've talked about these. Algorithm-driven outrage. If you spend any time on social media, you've seen that. Frank Bruni, another New York Times columnist. Frank actually lives not too far from him. Some of you may know him. He teaches at Duke, New York Times columnist, and I'm going to share some in the links that I'm going to send you. There's some stories from him as well. But he points out the fact that the best information must be distinguishable from the worst, and it must find an audience with open minds. The digital revolution, particularly with AI, has created a chaos of boutique obsessions, splenetic social media posts, deep fakes, and slop. And you probably see that. The White House Correspondents' Dinner the other night, I think it was Saturday night, between the shooting and about 12 hours later the next morning, I got between push notifications on my phone and email messages from the news organizations I followed, probably 90 different stories or updates about the shooting, which is a lot for anybody to handle. So later that afternoon, as I'm scrolling on Instagram, I'm beginning to see all sorts of videos claiming that the shooting was staged. People who have actually used the 3D camera inside the Hilton that gives you a tour to show how things went down. It's really hard to keep up with. This is where the picture truth bizarre quote came from. Reality is whatever we've decided to purchase. And it's so much easier to validate your belief by only following news organizations that support that, by cocooning and not being open-minded enough to check out other news sources. I'm going to go through this really quickly to tell you how things have changed between 2020 and 2026. When George Floyd was murdered in May of 2020, there was a video that was discussed a lot that was shared on Facebook more than 100 times. There were no AI tools really to speak of back then, and social media was moderated. So when Renee Good and Alex Pretty were killed in Minneapolis, false claims, doctored images, and videos were shared more than 1 million times in the first 24 hours. Artificial intelligence tools took over. You've probably seen some videos and pictures based on that. People in the administration were, you probably are aware of what they were posting and what they were saying. They were supporting that. And because filters have been removed from social media, there's just no boundaries anymore. I'm going to skip over Nick Shirley just based on time, a journalist talking about the Somali daycares. But I do want to point out, this is some comments. I looked up his video on YouTube, and this is the mindset of a lot of people these days. Look at these three. These are the top 3 comments about this guy who was posing as a journalist, and we found out he's not. This is what journalists used to do 20 years ago. The old boy who's done the research is that's my blacked out, is a patriot, absolute hero. And Tim Walz needs to go to prison. There's so many people who are so entrenched in that mindset where they're cheering on the demise of traditional journalism and good journalism sources and rallying toward people like Nick Shirley. So what we have now is what we call an authenticity collapse. That's not my word. Eilon Yamin of CopyLeaks, he's a former journalist. This is important to know, the fact that the internet is lying by default. And because of that, if you live on the internet, and we know that about 75 or 80% of the people get all of their news on Facebook, the only news they consume is off of Facebook, there's a danger of losing touch with reality. And for the free press, what does it mean? Hannah Arendt, who is a writer and political theorist, she says that when we don't have a free press, anything can happen. And we're at a point where nobody believes anything any longer. And that's the point that we're getting to right now. One of the things I like to do when I read a really good story on New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, is I like to look at comments. Particularly if it's a really, really well done story. As a journalist, I like to see how readers are responding. And a couple of weeks ago, I was reading a story about climate change. And this is one of the comments, and I share this with you again to emphasize that there are so many people who firmly believe that the press is evil. And this commenter said, talking about the press, they are coordinated co-conspirators working against the Constitution and the interests of the citizenry and for the interests of the Democratic Party and its financial backers. So that's kind of what we as journalists who are trying to talk about the truth and trying to take that First Amendment responsibility seriously are up against. I apologize for the profanity in this slide here. This is actually a headline in a story in Wired magazine that talked about how the Trump administration has borrowed tools from social media to spread the word far and wide and convince people of things that are really not true. So I'm going to go through this quickly. It shouldn't be a surprise. We have a man in the Oval Office, 34 felony counts, lies constantly. Right now, we're coming up on the 40,000th lie that Trump has told as president. We know about his administration, more than 30 people formerly from Fox News that had to pay $787.5 million for lying. We shouldn't be surprised. So Trump 1 was bad. Yeah, it was bad. Trump 2, with the guardrails gone, with a loyalty test in place, Project 2025, all these things, vengeance, retribution, there's a real change. I was going through some boxes a few weeks ago of things that I've just kept from work, trying to get rid of and purge things. And I came across this. This is a 56-page report that talked about, it's called The Trump Administration and the Media, Attacks on Press Credibility, Endanger U.S. Democracy and Global Press Freedom. And I don't remember printing this out. And then I realized this was from just Trump's first term. Think about what the second term report would be like, and it's not out yet. Obviously, this is a joke. You can't read this, but I started, ever since Mary contacted me and asked me about speaking, I thought I'm going to make a list of all the egregious things that take place. And the list actually goes way down here. And I know you can't read it, but it's just to show you that Trump's, in terms of Trump's greatest hits, the things that we as journalists have been reporting on that are factual, it's a long, long list. There's so much to keep up with. About 5 minutes before I packed up my laptop to come over here, I saw this in my email. Some of you, in fact, a couple of you have mentioned to me that you saw it too, with Brendan Carr and the FCC ramping up attacks against ABC and Disney. Recklessness is what we're after. This again is an editorial cartoon that focused on the Iranian war, but part of the danger of the administration is the fact that there's no planning, there's no strategy. And it's danger to us. It poses significant risk, as we know, to national security, but also to our standing in the world and to we as the citizens of the United States. And you think about the folks who are elected. There's been some really fascinating podcasts and interviews that I've heard, people talking about how can so many people who were working in the administration who were opposed to Trump now be showing so much fealty to him. So there are a lot of major problems there. One of them, obviously, in terms of the Constitution, is Congress that has ceded so much of its authority to Trump. But the only way now in this day and age in Washington for you to have power is for you to cede it back to Trump. Your number one job is to support him. If you don't, we've all seen what's happened when people in his administration have turned on him and what happens. Supreme Court is still kind of a little bit of a question mark, but we've seen the court do some pretty questionable things. And what's happened in so much in Washington is we've abandoned conscience in favor of obedience. Won't go through this, but there's a lot of crazy legislation that the people who were so enamored of Trump, one of the new ones, that's my 35-minute mark. One of the new ones is a $250 bill with Trump's picture on it. And you've all heard in the last couple of weeks about the National Institutes of Health. Congress is going to be considering asking the National Institutes of Health to do a study on Trump derangement syndrome. I would love to take time to walk through all the threats that Trump has made against the press. I'm not going to, but I'm going to share a link to this Huffington Post story about that, but there's a lot of them. And that's part of the dictator's playbook. And you've probably all seen lists. The New York Times in its opinion section has kind of a running list of 7 or 8 different indicators of a dictator and where Trump lands on that. But one of them, of course, is to undermine the free press. And that's one of the dangers of a dictator. This is the Trump anti-press social media tracker. So there's an organization that has been tracking posts on Truth Social and on Twitter, on Twitter when Trump was on Twitter, that are opposed to the media, something that attacks the journalists and attacks credibility. And so far, I checked this morning, he had 2,518 posts on X, And the running total right now on Truth Social is 1,157. So that's different posts that attack the news media, part of the dictator's playbook. You probably know about this. This is the White House's official media offender of the week page. We think about all the things that have been taken off government websites, and this is something that's been adding on. It's sad. Another Sulzberger quote, as we think about fighting against dictatorship, we as journalists and you as people who like to consume journalism have to keep sharing, remembering, preaching that we're not the resistance. Journalists are not the resistance. We're not anybody's opposition. Our loyalty is to the truth and to a public that deserves to know it. You deserve to know what's happening. Joyce Vance is another person who puts out a newsletter that I follow. Some of you may know her. But interesting quote here. It's a familiar refrain. Anybody who opposes Trump is the enemy. The secret sauce for Trump is that he's always right, which means any news outlet that engages in even mild criticism has got to be punished. And that's what we're seeing. More considerations there. That we can think about the First Amendment. The First Amendment, I don't know what's going to happen. The First Amendment, the First Amendment will stay enshrined in our Constitution. But Trump doesn't have to shut down the press. He just has to convince Americans not to believe accurate reporting, which is so many people do. You don't have to shut them down if you can convince that the press is lying. And if you watch the 60 Minutes episode a couple of days ago, the interview that was done with Trump, demeaning the attacks on the press, they're just so constant. So the First Amendment guarantees a free press, but it cannot guarantee the trusted one. And that's where you guys come in. And I want to wrap up with this about what our role is. Melanie, who's in the back, if you're on LinkedIn, I would encourage you to follow Melanie. Melanie is a wonderful observer of what's taking place in major media, particularly the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others. And there's so much that she has shared with a lot of wisdom about how the press needs to respond, because there are things that we can do differently. And this is from one of her posts. And as a part of this post, she shared about things that journalists can do. The way that reporting has happened, there's a lot of horse race reporting. And part of that is the fact that as the zone has been flooded with stuff. I don't know if any of you listen to the New York Times headlines, little podcasts every morning. Every morning it's an 8 or 10 minute long kind of a summary of the news. And there's always, and now the latest on the Trump administration, and every day there's 3 or 4 or 5 more things to be concerned about if you're an American or if you're a journalist. And that kind of reporting is good, but the press can do a little bit better. And some of the things that Melanie has outlined here are really, really good ideas. And she's going to come up in just a minute and help answer questions, and maybe she can talk about that. But we need to do a better job about talking about who benefited, who lost, talking about all the reversal, particularly in climate change, for example, keeping track of the cumulative effects of those and sharing that, more tracking of the results of changes that the administration has put in place. And as she says here at the very end, confronting the reality that telling the story and getting people crucial information aren't always the same thing. We've got to do explainers and we've got to tell a story, but we also have to be able to provide people key information in a real simple way. What you can do, be intentional about where you get your news. Get news from organizations that verify their work, that can be trusted. Value evidence over affirmation. I have a hard time with this personally. If I see something that perfectly aligns with what I believe, I tend to embrace it. And it's good every now and then to go to other news sources that you may not be familiar with, just to see what they're saying, to get some perspective. Support journalism. I know that a lot of you do. Good journalism is worth paying for. We're in a situation now where, because of the advertising model having disintegrated, News organizations more than ever rely on reader revenue. And there are a lot of I was talking about Heather Cox Richardson earlier, her newsletter. I pay $5 a month to get that. There's a number of those that I do. It's easy for you to pay $5 or $10 or $15 a month to support really, really good journalism. And then defend the principles, even when you don't like the coverage, because the First Amendment doesn't only protect journalism that you agree with. Another quote from Sulzberger. I hate it when the speaker reads all of the words that are on the slide, so I won't do that. But this is really important, because if a free press goes away and there are no longer people holding government accountable and politicians accountable, what's going to happen? We talk a lot about this on the local level because newspapers are closing at the rate of 2 or 3 a week. Over half the jobs in journalism have been lost in the last 10 or 12 years. I don't know about the News Observer's newsroom, but I know when I was publisher of the Sanford Herald, we had 16 people in our newsroom. The newsroom now has 2 people. When we had the News and Record, we had 4 reporters and a sports editor, which was a very, very heavy staff for a newspaper of our size. And now when I see a copy of the News and Record online, it's all wire stories. There are a few bylines, but there's just not much local coverage. And that's because it costs. But it's important that free press exists, because free press has been one of the things that has made the country sustainable for 250 years. And why we need a free press, and I'll wrap up with this. Obviously, the free press is a constitutional firewall against tyranny. Truth, reality, and the obligations of checks and balances are critical to the survival of the country. We've seen what happens in countries where that doesn't happen. And again, it ensures political accountability. This is my cell phone number, my email address. I'm happy to have anybody reach out at any time with any questions. I am not working at a newspaper now. I do a little bit of writing for Business North Carolina and a couple of other magazines, so I'm kind of out of the journalism game. But I'm still a student of it. It's something that the very first byline I had in the Sanford Herald was when I was 13 years old. So I've had 7, I think I counted 7 different decades that I've been a part of a newspaper. And I love it. And I love the country. I love our country. And I respect so much what great journalists do to tell stories and the attacks that they put up with. There's still really good journalism taking place. There's been a lot of criticism, for example, of the Washington Post because of what Jeff Bezos has done, and I didn't have a chance to get into that. But there's still really good journalism taking place there. The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, a lot of different places. I'm going to send you in the email you're going to get a long list of news organizations that are not national newspapers that you might consider getting news from, because they're so good, so good. So I appreciate your attention. I apologize for having to go through this so quickly, but I'm happy to be here and happy to answer questions. And Melanie, if you'll come up.
My email box fills up constantly with all kinds of places wanting to pay for this commentator, that commentator, the Midas Network, the different networks. It seems like I could spend hundreds of dollars on all these different sources, and it gets a little exhausting to have them. It would be nice to have a paper that actually had a variety of perspectives coming in at once with as opposed to having to pay $4 to hear one perspective, $5 a month to hear another perspective. And I find that a very frustrating process for figuring out how to access the news. And your thoughts about better ways to deal with that?
Yeah, the only thing I can do is tell you my strategy, and I'm the guy who subscribes to tons and tons of newsletters, because when we were putting together newsletters at the News and Record, we were trying to build our audience with newsletters. There's a lot that I still read. If you're not familiar with Substack, some of the folks I'm going to recommend you check out are on Substack. you can subscribe to 100 different things on Substack and not pay a penny, or you could pay $5 a month or whatever. I think you just have to strategize and figure out what resonates the most with you and what gives you the kind of information you want. Unfortunately, there's so much more national perspective, and not as much local. I will tell you one news source that I really, really enjoy. It's called Tangle. Anybody familiar with Tangle? So Tangle was kind of designed as an unbiased reporting that they produce a newsletter each day, and they take on one issue. They take on one question a day, and they provide you both the perspective from news organizations that lean left and news organizations that lean right. And it's very, very valuable. I pay for it. I can't remember how much I pay. It's not much, but this has grown exponentially in the last few years because it's really a straight ahead news, finding out what the facts are and reporting them. And then you also have a kind of an editorial take or perspective on whatever that subject is from one of the folks on the news team. So I would encourage you to check out Tangle. And Melanie, who has to sift through a lot more than I do, you want to take the crack at that?
Yeah, it's kind of like watching television, cable had the bundle. And now, you get your HBO and you get your Hulu and it's like, and I don't know if I'm always thinking like, I need to cancel some of these, and so we're going through that and there are a couple of collaborative, I don't know what the right word, but journalists coming together to create a bundle so they can sell together. Some of the former Washington Post reporters are part of one. And I think we're going to see more of that because there is fatigue and there is, for individual journalists too, running a business while also doing the journalism, it's a lot to keep up with. There's not just journalists, but there are all kinds of other information sources that are coming with fundraising pitches because they're tied to other kinds of organizations. So as Bill said, you can't pay for them all. Quite a number have the freemium model where you can get this for free, and if you want like more, you pay. And so I have a number I read that are free, and then a few that I pay for. Anybody else have an answer on that? I don't know if you.
I think NC Newsline is about the best for me for local political news mostly, but environmental and we've had their
And Newsline is good.
To center and it's
Can I mention NC?
very worthy.
Yeah. So I want to just mention I'm retired from professional journalism, but I'm the board chair of a nonprofit startup called NC Local. And NC Local is really aiming to help many more people around our state know what's happening at the state level, and especially how it affects people locally, because, North Carolina is one of the states where most policy is set at the state level and then delivered locally. And we've seen this big loss of reporters that cover Raleigh for communities. So North Carolina used to have, Winston-Salem paper had a reporter in Raleigh. The Asheville paper had a reporter in Raleigh, Wilmington. They're all gone. And meanwhile, the legislature's doing a lot of stuff. And so they're changing policy a lot and it affects people. So we also work in partnership with news organizations. So we're not trying to replace them, but we're trying to create a support network for that. And so much of this to me is trying to separate journalism somewhat from politics, in that so much local journalism was never about partisan politics. It was a way for people to know what was happening in the community, for businesses to reach their customers, for nonprofit organizations to let people in the community know what was happening. And then politics was in there, but we're working a lot at NC Local just to explain to people in really practical terms what's happening and what impact it's going to have. And so if you think about supporting journalism, I think you think about maybe, how do I feel about my community? What are the important things about my community? Who's providing information on that? And how can I support them?
Yeah, and I have a link to NC Local in the email that you get. And NC Local is actually producing stories, both by reporters who work for NC Local through funding that we've gotten, and then also through collaboration from existing organizations. You mentioned and NC Health News is also excellent. Carolina Public Press. There's a lot of great. Some are for profit, some are nonprofit, but there's some such excellent reporting being done. But NC Newsline is one of my favorites too.
Thank you for the presentation. We're grateful. You said you're going to be sharing the information that you have, and I don't know how you're going to be sharing it, but I want to make sure I get a copy of it. So how is that going to happen?
I've got an email message ready to go that has a long list of books, news sources, individual articles, podcasts, and links to all of it that I'm going to have Mary send to you all as part of the email message that comes out after that. So, and I'll have my email address in there if there's any questions you have for me. But yeah, it's a long list.
So that's an advantage of being a member of the club, because the email goes to club members. And if you join now, it'll go through June of 27.
And if you were a member last year and didn't become a member this year, you're probably still on the list. You get 1 year.
Yep.
Don't mean to interrupt the promotional message. You mentioned earlier that journalism students do not subscribe to print very often now. That ship may have sailed, but if you look at something like the New York Times, it still does both. Have we lost anything with the demise of print?
I think for me, what I've lost is the tactile sensation of going through the paper and looking at every story on every page. What I do now, so I don't know how many Wall Street Journal subscribers, but there are. But Wall Street Journal, they send out an email message about 12:30, 1 o'clock every morning that has just headlines, and they're all hyperlinks. So you can click on, so you can open up that day's edition, and there will be 30 or 35 or 40 headlines, and I might read 1 or 2 stories, whereas when I had the paper, when I subscribed to the physical paper, I would read a whole lot more. So I think that's part of what we've lost, and particularly with local. We in the days when I was the publisher of the Herald, we would have 24, 26, 28 pages, and we would have 2 or 3 local stories on most of those pages. And if you are a digital subscriber, you're spending less time. I mean, I guarantee you're probably spending less time in front of your computer or your tablet or your phone consuming that news. And those consumption habits are part of what's driving, I think, the problem, because it is so easy, again, to rely on a few news sources that kind of support your ideology to where you're getting an incomplete picture. But yeah, I think we've lost a lot by not having print. Even news organizations, they're still doing print, have had to cut back on pages. We're in a situation right now where newsprint prices are in the process of going up, and it's going to become even harder to monetize that. So it's, again, you think about the amount of digital information you consume that's not news. Is a lot of time the average person, I know if you get notifications from your iPhone about how many hours a day you spent in the last week on your iPhone, it's embarrassing. So, and not a lot of that is with news. So I don't know if you got that.
Cat videos.
Hi there. Thank you both for being here. I take to heart your recommendation that we should be willing to consume content that does not align with our own beliefs. I think I can take it. What I can't take is lies and propaganda. And so I'm interested in suggestions that you may have for media outlets that perhaps are representing a conservative viewpoint, but in a way that is also honest journalism.
I will tell you about 2 that I get that sometimes I really have a hard time with. One of them is the Free Press. Barry Weiss, the former New York Times person who now is head of CBS News. I sometimes bite my tongue when I'm reading some of that, but I do subscribe and I do support it because of the work that they're trying to do. And there's a statewide newsletter that I get called Nexus News that is put together by a company called the Results Company, and it's kind of a think tank. They do a lot of consulting work, but they've been developing this newsletter for a number of years, and it's changed. But it's primarily focused on state news, and there's a little bit of an editorial bent at times. Particularly on Saturday, it might just be a whole editorial, and it is very right leaning. And I like to read that because it's thoughtfully done. I don't always agree with it, but it's an exercise for me to try to get through that, and it can be frustrating at times. I try, I honestly try to go to Fox News from time to time, and it's just the place where I take my car to get its service. Fox News is very prominent. And it's hard because 2 or 3 minutes of that, knowing what I've read earlier in the day from various sources and to hear their take on it is very, very difficult. So, but those two, the Free Press, I don't know if you read the Free Press?
No. I don't have as high an opinion of it, but I think that it is a challenge. In North Carolina, so there's a publication called the Carolina Journal. And I used to read it pretty regularly when I was at the News and Observer because it was coming from from the right, but they did a lot of reporting. They had some good investigative reporting in there. And, I read it because it came from a different point of view. It went through a bad spell where it lost its editors. The editor was a former newspaper guy, and they follow journalistic standards, and it was not propaganda. But I think it's recovered and it's doing some good work again. And it's North Carolina focused, so it kind of gives you a sense of how that news, looking at that news through a different lens. I would say like Newsline looks at news more through a left-leaning lens. Generally, more progressive, again, it's not like they're a journalistic operation. They don't pursue, political agenda outright in their reporting, but they do have a kind of progressive view of the world. And so that comes through. I want to say one thing about A.G. Sulzberger. I respect him tremendously, obviously, but I think he is, being at the New York Times, which is probably the only news organization that has truly thrived in the digital era financially because of some very smart business decisions to diversify their business with turning their recipe archive into a product that generates tremendous amount of money for them, buying Wordle, things like that. They've had some very smart business strategy. But I think he is not recognizing when he says we're not the opposition, that there is opposition, that there is this idea of neutrality means that he's not recognizing the institutional biases in the New York Times itself and their need to really understand that there is, an effort to oppress the First Amendment, and they know this. They report on it all the time. But I think that that point of view, the idea that you, don't have a position at a time like this is that, and I'm not talking about taking a partisan position. NC Local is nonpartisan. I've been nonpartisan my entire career in how I approach news. But I think understanding that an institution with the power of the New York Times has tremendous influence, and like all institutions, needs accountability. So they eliminated their public editor position years ago, which was a position that held them accountable. And I think they don't kind of recognize the need for journalism and news organizations to actually take a stand on some things and recognize that so much power and wealth is accruing in the hands of a small portion of society. And so to kind of take that step and understand that the New York Times is in a position, so recognize what your position is. And I think that's important for all newsrooms to say, you know, what is our worldview? What do we stand for? And I think being retired and like many of you have time to read, right? And time to read history, and history is so much more rewarding at this stage of life than it was when I studied it in college. And understanding that in every era, you know, the press, journalism has been players in events in different ways, and not always like beacons of truth. That there is a politics to journalism. And so this era is probably a lot like the first quarter of the 20th century, when, you know, publications like the Catholic Worker, and there were a lot of publications from political groups, workers, unions, you know, that it wasn't that journalism was over here in this kind of neutral zone. And so I think thinking about the bigger picture is really important for all of us to think about, like, is Trump a cause or a symptom or something? Is, you know, and I think the worst thing that's happened is this extreme polarization, this kind of focus all the time on the most extreme rhetoric and so on. And the fact that most of us don't live in that space, right? Most of us don't feel that we look at the world as extreme partisans. And so the challenge for journalism is to recognize that most people are not extreme partisans, and really figure out how we serve the majority of people who just want to know what's happening, want to know what they can do about it, want to know how things affect them, and want to know, like, is somebody, you know, stealing our money? Is somebody committing crimes? And so that's what I spend most of my time thinking about these days, and what our organization is working to do. Sorry for the long speech, but Bill got me thinking.
Okay.
Probably the last question.
Okay. Yeah, from the Zoom audience, the question is, most young people I meet don't look at news except through their social media. Do you see any chance of reversing that?
I don't, I would like to be hopeful. You know, I think back to when we were an afternoon newspaper, and so we would go to press about 12:30, and I'd go to lunch about 1 or 2, and all the restaurants, half the tables or more had the newspaper there. They were reading the newspaper. Newspapers were so you know, everywhere in movies, and I mean everywhere. And you know, I go out today, if I see somebody reading a newspaper in a coffee shop, I'm just shocked. So I think, you know, I grew up in a reading household, and obviously my family had the newspapers, so newspapers were a big part of that. But reading was a big part of it, and consuming news and talking about the news and watching Walter Cronkite and talking about all that was a big part of it. You know, I think the lowest common denominator is kind of what's happening. You know, as fewer households have a newspaper, you know, there's no expectation for a 17-year-old whose parents didn't grow up with a newspaper, whose grandparents may have had a newspaper. You know, there's no expectation that's a part of your life. That caring about your community and getting involved and joining a civic club is a part of your responsibility as a citizen of the community. And I think that's dangerous because we're so self-absorbed now. There's been such a transition where it's all about me and my experiences and my time. And I knew that, I learned that working with young journalists who, you know, we were 24/7, 365, you know, whenever there was news, you had to be there. And working with so many young journalists is like, well, at 5 o'clock, I'm done, and I'm going to go do this. So I think it's a societal change that I don't, if it's going to shift, I don't know how, unfortunately.
So wasn't this fascinating? I think we all have some reading to do, so maybe you could go home and read something tonight on the screen. And then members will get the whole list of all the cartoons, but no cat videos.
Thank you. Hey, how are you? Yeah, good to see you.